Well, good morning. Thanks for coming to the session this morning. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your goodness. We pray that you would give us grace as we seek to lead institutions and be a part of communities to resist the ways that the world seeks to hijack and steer us. So we ask for your grace and your blessing now. Give us wisdom and insight and courage. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, yesterday, Megan Basham outlined some of the ways that left-wing groups have sought to hijack and steer Christian institutions over the last 20 years. It's a preview of her forthcoming book, Shepherds for Sale. Now, as a journalist, Megan understandably focused on major institutions and ministries: the Southern Baptist Convention, Christianity Today, Saddleback Church. Left-wing billionaires sought to co-opt or neutralize these major Christian institutions through the offer of money and respectability. But most Christians aren't decision makers in major institutions like that. You're not on the board of Christianity Today. You're not an elder at North Point Church. Left-wing billionaires, I suspect, are not offering your school lots of money. And yet, it's almost certainly the case that your institutions have been affected by those efforts. And what I want to do in this talk is describe that next step. How it is that normal churches, schools, ministries were and are sabotaged and steered by these larger efforts. To do so, I want to begin with a biblical example that will act as a kind of paradigm for us to think about these issues. The story's recorded in Galatians chapter 2, and it's the confrontation at Antioch. So if you have a Bible or want to take a look, you can pick up there as we go. So, Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Now, in this particular passage, a number of different groups and individuals are mentioned. So first, you have the circumcision party, which is probably either unbelieving Jews who were persecuting Christians in Jerusalem. That's my guess is that's who it is. It could, though, be the agitators and troublers, the Jesus plus circumcision Christians, the false brothers that Paul talks about earlier in the book. So you've got them, the circumcision party. Then you have James and the Jerusalem apostles, who, significantly in Galatians 2, had not previously compelled Gentiles like Titus to be circumcised. They had agreed in chapter 2, verse 3, Titus does not need to be circumcised. Then you have the men from James, the emissaries, the ambassadors who come to Peter with some kind of message. And then there's Peter, then the rest of the Jews, then Barnabas, the Gentile Christians, and last of all, Paul. There's a number of different groups that just packed into this one short passage. And as we can tell, this is a highly combustible situation. It's filled with potential for social stampedes and scapegoating. If you read the early chapters of the book of Acts, you know that these sorts of issues were highly fraught. There have already been persecutions in Jerusalem in response to the preaching of the apostles, in response to the inclusion of the Gentiles. And so with that kind of background, reconstruct what happens here in Antioch. Up to this point, Peter has been regularly sharing table fellowship with Gentile Christians. Then something happens, we're not told specifically what, and James sends some men to Peter with a message. And we're not told exactly what was said. So I'm going to speculate a little bit, and I don't think I'm unwarranted in doing so. And I think it probably went something like this. Peter, look, dining with the Gentiles is creating some problems for us. Okay, you got to understand what it's like here. Like we're under a lot of pressure here in Jerusalem. The circumcision party, they are stirring things up. People are being hauled before the Sanhedrin. They're getting kicked out of their synagogue. Some people have even been arrested. It's pretty rough. And look, people hear that you're eating with uncircumcised Gentiles. And so look, for the moment, do you think you could turn the heat down for us? Maybe just back off for a while until things cool off. So in other words, we don't have to assume that James and Peter have completely rejected the gospel of God's grace. In fact, it's clear that they haven't. Their actions here are described as hypocrisy, believing one thing but acting in a different way. Instead, it's more likely that the appeal from James was an appeal about wisdom and prudence, about fear of the circumcision party, and compassion for those who were being persecuted by them. But whatever the specific message was, it changes Peter's behavior. He does draw back. He separates himself from the Gentiles. And the rest of the Jews, including Barnabas, join him in that hypocritical separation. What I want to suggest is this is a classic example of the hijacking and steering of the church, or of a Christian ministry, perhaps of a school. So how does it work? So I want you to picture those different groups that we outlined sort of standing in a line, each of them with a different steering wheel on their back. So the circumcision party reaches over and steers James and the church in Jerusalem. How so? Well, by threats of ostracism and violence. You'll be removed from the synagogue. You'll be taken to jail. James and his men then reach over and steer Peter. How? Well, by fear, that's explicitly stated, and likely, as I said, by compassion. Look how hard it is for us. What about Peter and the rest of the Jews? Well, they join Peter. They're following him as their leader. So Peter's influence to the next step is simply the fact that he is a leader. His credibility as an apostle leads his people to imitate him. And Barnabas, it seems, is the last one to be steered, clearly by peer pressure. Peter and everybody else has joined in the separation, and you can imagine Barnabas sort of reluctantly, perhaps, joining them on the far side of the cafeteria. Everyone else is doing it. So notice here a few elements of the progression. First, the pressure works from the outside in. It works from the outside in, and it uses different steering wheels, particularly here, I think, pathos and ethos. Second, the greatest pressure comes from those closest. We'll return to this later. Third, a key dynamic is the need to separate from undesirable Christians. And fourth, we can see that cowardice is contagious. That's the significance of that phrase, even Barnabas was led astray. Even Barnabas. We're meant to feel the force of the even. This is the son of encouragement. This is the man who, at great risk to himself, went and brought the newly converted Apostle Paul into the fledgling church. The last time they'd seen this guy, he had been persecuting them, and Barnabas, at great risk, says, I'm going to go bring him in. And yet, even Barnabas was led astray. And finally, as we take stock of this whole situation, what animates all of these steering wheels stacked next to each other, as different as they may be, is living under what we might call the circumcision gaze. Living under the circumcision gaze. Now, what do I mean by that? The circumcision gaze there is a modification of a concept that I learned called the white gaze. It's a concept popularized by the author Toni Morrison. And according to her, she was a black novelist, and she wrote that the white gaze has to do with one's default reader or observer, the idealized audience for which someone writes and speaks. And so for Morrison, she said, black authors writing under the white gaze feel constrained to adapt to the assumptions of their white readers. In other words, the default assumptions of white readers were taken to be normative. Here's what the entry in Wikipedia as it describes this concept. Authors of color describe it as a voice in their heads that reminds them that their writing, characters, and plot choices are going to be judged by white readers, and that reader or viewer by default is white. Morrison once wrote, "What happens to the writerly imagination of a black author who is at some level always conscious of representing one's race to or in spite of another race of readers that understands itself to be universal or race-free?" The unspoken implication from Morrison is that the imagination is stunted, strangled, smothered beneath such pressure. And so I'd suggest that in this situation at Antioch, James, Peter, the Jewish Christians, and Barnabas were all living under the circumcision gaze. It was those assumptions, those values that were taken to be normative and which they must accommodate. Now, That's the passage. Now I want to then take that concept and I want to bring it forward, say, to the last 20 years. And so we'll begin by thinking about the three worlds framework popularized by Aaron Renn. You perhaps have heard of this. Renn argues that there's been three phases of American secularization, the church's secularization. There was positive world prior to 1994, from about the 50s to 1994, where society at large has a largely positive orientation to Christianity. To be known as a good church-going man was the same thing as being an upstanding citizen. Christianity was a status enhancer. Christian moral norms were the basic moral norms of society. But then, beginning in 94 and running to about 2014, society moved to neutral world. It took a neutral stance toward Christianity. It no longer had the privileged status, but it's not necessarily disfavored. Being a Christian may be weird, but it's not necessarily negative to one's social status. It's a valid option within the pluralistic public square. And Christian moral norms retain some measure of residual effect. But then in 2014 to the present, we moved into negative world. Christianity is now not a positive nor even neutral, but it's a negative. It's a status diminisher. Christian morality is expressly repudiated. It's seen as a threat to the public good. And so subscribing to Christian moral views or violating that new secular moral order brings negative consequences. Now, significantly, Renn identifies different ministry strategies that were used in, say, positive and neutral world. So, for example, in positive world, the strategies used by Christians were things like culture war or seeker sensitivity. You can think about the moral majority and the seeker-sensitive movement from the 80s and 90s. In neutral world, the strategy was cultural engagement. Not culture war, but cultural engagement. And for our purposes, I want to highlight three features of Renn's treatment of neutral world. First, culture engagers placed a particular emphasis on cities. The culture that they sought to engage was urban, elite, and secular. Second, as a result, culture engagers sought to maintain a seat at the pluralistic table for the sake of Christian witness. We want to be in the room where it happens, and therefore we want to orient in such a way that they welcome us into that neutral public square. And third, in pursuit of that seat, culture engagers sought to consciously differentiate themselves from the culture warriors of the religious right and the previous generation. The differentiation they offered was centered on ministry posture. We're going to be winsome, not hostile. We're going to be compassionate, not harsh. We're going to be nuanced, not black and white. And these virtues offered credibility. And in neutral world, credibility was currency. And of course, we should note here that the Bible does commend versions of these virtues. The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. So kind, not quarrelsome, patient, gentle, aiming to persuade our opponents. And as we'll see later, Paul also sought to remove unnecessary barriers to Christian faith. He adapted to his audience in some measure in order that by any means possible he might save some. I'll return to that in a moment. And of course, the book of Proverbs tells us to be wise and discerning as we handle complex issues in a fallen world. But the net result was that the quest for credibility in urban elite context and the desire to differentiate themselves from culture warriors meant that culture engagers came to live their lives and conduct their ministries under the progressive gaze. Under the progressive gaze, the default unbeliever, before whom we live and move and have our being, is presumed to be urban, liberal, and progressive. And thus we write and speak and live in such a way that our words, we think, will have maximum persuasive power to them. Or at least we write so as to make the Christian faith comprehensible to the progressive, attempting, insofar as we can, to validate their concerns, share their sensitivities in hopes of winning them to the gospel. And the result is that many Christians came to have an imaginary progressive in their head, or you could think of it on their shoulder. And this imaginary progressive shaped our rhetoric, our orientation, and our framing of various issues. You know you're under the influence of the progressive gaze when someone says, hey, remember, the world is watching. And the world is presumed to be coastal elites who inhabit urban centers, as opposed to the coal miner in the red hat who hasn't been to church since he was 8. It's progressive sensitivities that we must take into account, progressive concerns that we must speak to, progressive hopes that we must show the gospel subversively fulfilling, progressive hostilities that we must share, and progressive enemies that we must denounce. And this is where the shift to negative world became highly significant. As the pluralistic public square of neutral world gave way to our new public civil religion, what I yesterday called the rainbow paideia, progressives began to use neutral world virtues as steering wheels on the backs of evangelicals, especially evangelical leaders. And I'm going to sketch the outlines of how this played out in lots of places. You'll have to wait for Megan's book to get details of the big ones. So under the progressive gaze, progressive values and concerns were normalized and taken to be the default operating system for society. Mainline Christian denominations baptized those progressive values, attaching Bible verses to them, often while studiously ignoring the rest of the Scripture's witness. These default progressive values included the oppressor-oppressed framework derived from critical theory, standpoint epistemology, which gave marginalized groups special insight that could not be corrected by quote-unquote oppressor groups, and then the intersectionality that piled up oppression to create a hierarchy of victims. And of course, you can go read the work of Vodi Bakum or Neil Shenvi if you want to track down more on the ideological dimension. But living under the progressive gaze, Christian churches implicitly adopted the progressive victimhood hierarchy, identifying minorities, immigrants, women, and the LGBTQ community as oppressed. And again, this is the ideological dimension of the hijacking. And the key thing is that ideological dimension was never formally and publicly debated or discussed. Instead, it was absorbed. It was submerged and implicit. Why? Because debate about it was smothered by appeals to pathos and ethos, emotion and credibility. So we know as classical educators, there's three elements to persuasion: logos, pathos, and ethos. And in principle, that ideological dimension belongs under the logos category. They're ideas which could be debated. Is this the way we ought to think about the world? But that debate was sublimated. It was submerged and set aside as pathos and ethos smothered it. Now, how did that happen? What do I mean? Well, Christians absorbed that victimhood hierarchy by osmosis. And at that point, Christian compassion, which was degenerating into untethered empathy, kicked in. And under the banner of social justice, Christians became advocates and activists, seeking to rectify past and present wrongs and to build credibility, there's ethos, for the gospel beneath the progressive gaze. Certain events, such as the shooting of Michael Brown or the death of George Floyd, became totems, icons for narratives of oppression and victimhood, testifying to the abiding injustices of our culture and thereby afforded opportunities for Christians to signal virtue under the progressive gaze. And given America's history, racism was particularly potent as the leading edge of the progressive gaze. Churches began book clubs, Sunday school classes, reinforcing the progressive gaze through concepts like anti-racism and white fragility. Misogyny and sexism in the church were likewise animating forces, again awakening compassion and inspiring advocates for various kinds of reform. And I'll just note it's important to stress at this moment that in some cases, real victims of real evil were in view. There were really wicked things that happened. And Christians were rightly moved by sincere compassion and a desire to do justice. At the same time, many of the books circulating offered skewed narrative based on specious statistics. Things like 1 in 4 women are victims of sexual assault, which provided a veneer of truth that reinforced narratives that were sustained in the church by empathy and the quest for credibility. Now, I've mentioned empathy a couple times. Let me just insert a little parenthesis about it. What do I mean by untethered empathy? And I'm simply going to quote Chesterton and Lewis and leave it there. But Chesterton once wrote that the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. That's what I mean by untethered. So, for example, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. You can think of the way that the scientists insisted that grandma must stay alone in the nursing home during COVID with no human contact. The science is settled. It's true, and it's pitiless. On the other hand, here's the key point, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful. Untruthful pity, untethered empathy. That's Chesterton. Lewis, talking about mercy, but getting at the same idea, says this: mercy, detached from justice, grows unmerciful. That is the important paradox. As there are plants which will flourish only in mountain soil, so it appears that mercy will flower only when it grows in the crannies of the rock of justice. Transplanted to the marshlands of mere humanitarianism, mercy becomes a man-eating weed, all the more dangerous because it is still called by the same name as the mountain variety. This is what happened to our compassion. Detached from justice, detached from moral order, untethered from what is true and what is good, it was transplanted to the marshlands of humanitarianism, and it became a man-eating weed. Now, the effectiveness of these initial movements, these compassionate movements, resulted in expanding victimhood through language inflation and concept creep. Language inflation and concept creep. We all remember when microaggressions and safe spaces became everyday language. Terms like abuse and trauma were enlarged to encompass a wider array of experiences. So no longer did abuse refer to a pattern of physical or sexual violence. Now, criticism, rebuke, correction, even just disagreement could be regarded as abuse. No longer did trauma refer to physical damage or even an event that caused severe emotional distress beyond normal human experience, which was the older definition of trauma. Instead, any emotional distress was regarded as harmful and traumatic, and empathy demanded that Christians comfort, nurture, and accommodate the traumatized. So Christians, therefore, became to implicitly adopt the subjective logic of victimhood, which is this: I'm hurt, therefore you sinned. I'm hurt, therefore you sinned. And thereby succumbed to the tyranny of the sensitive. In all of this, many Christians, and especially Christian leaders, had their eyes on three groups, all of whom reinforced the progressive gaze. Victims or oppressed groups, who were the objects of empathy and the possessors of special knowledge. Advocates, who were the arbiters of justice. And other respectable Christians, who were the purveyors of credibility. And through this mix of empathy, justice, and credibility, the world discovered a powerful steering wheel for the church, one that, as Megan noted yesterday, was exploited by progressive billionaires to neutralize and co-opt God's people for its own purposes. Now, in light of that, let's bring it down to the ground and bring these together with what we saw in Galatians, those dynamics we saw. How does it work? How maybe did it even work in churches and communities that you were a part of? Well, just imagine again that the world begins to put pressure on Christians to act in a certain way, creating an expectation. But as a faithful Christian, of course, you don't care what the world thinks. Jesus said they would hate us. I don't care what the world thinks. The pressure doesn't hit you directly. But Christian A cares what the world thinks. Oh, but you don't care what Christian A thinks. Christian A is compromised. And so you ignore it again. But Christian B cares what Christian A thinks. Oh, but you don't care about Christian B either. He's not in your community. He's a good guy, but not a part of your church. See, but Christian C, he cares what Christian B thinks. And Christian C is a pastor in your denomination, a member of your school board, a respected member of your community, a close friend. And now he is channeling and amplifying the worldly pressure directly to you. This is the important principle again. The greatest pressure comes from those closest to you. The greatest pressure comes from those closest to you. And this, of course, is not a bad thing. It's a good and glorious thing. This is what friendship is. You ought to care what your fellow pastors think or what respected members of your community think. You ought to desire their wisdom. Humility demands you look at yourself with sober judgment. I could be wrong. And you receive counsel from other godly leaders. But we ought always to be alert to the way that this good gift can be hijacked and used to trouble and derail your church, your school, or your community. So that raises the question, how can you tell the difference then between the wrong kind of pressure and the right kind? Well, one key test is whether you can overtly and candidly name the issue. Can you talk about the elephant in the room? Or is the pressure always subtle, always masked, always out of direct view? In your discussions, are you seeking to persuade each other of what's good and wise using logos and pathos and ethos? Or are you seeking to pressure and manipulate each other to avoid conflict? This underscores that the kind of sensitivity, leaders must be sensitive. Sensitive to what? The kind of sensitivity leaders need is a sensitivity to their own passions, their own reactions. We have to be able to name the pressure, to identify its source, to see how it is traveling through our community and how it justifies and rationalizes itself. And again, recent years have provided ample opportunities to examine these dynamics. So you think of the controversies over COVID restrictions, over COVID vaccine, over race, gender, sexuality, political philosophy, culture engagement. Each of these conflicts careened through congregations and schools, provoking reactions, magnifying divisions, and while the particulars may have varied, the reactive dynamics were the same. As worldly pressure was laundered through Christian rhetoric and brought to bear on Christian leaders across the country. Or let's consider another feature of that Galatians situation and bring it into our modern context: the pressure to separate from other Christians. Now, in the first century, it was the uncircumcised Gentiles. Who is it today? Who is it for your community? Because it's important that it might be different for different communities. There will be pressure not to read that author, or listen to that podcast, or attend that conference, or be a part of that church, or associate with those people. And in this, slander is often one of the world's favorite steering wheels. It's an effective weapon to create that pressure. It preys on our fear of man and our desire for their approval. Sins that are two sides of the same coin. And you have to recognize that the true target of slander is not often who we think. We think that the person who is slandered is the target. And that's obviously true. But the true target is often that guy's friends. The goal is to make the slandered one so toxic that others simply sidle away from him, putting a respectable distance of deniability between them. To tie in that previous principle, the world will often slander others in order to steer you by your soft-hearted friends. The world will often slander others in order to steer you by your soft-hearted friends. So Christian C puts pressure on you to avoid associating with Christian D because of what the world and Christian A and Christian C think about him. These sorts of accusations are designed to create a fog around a person in hopes that people will say, look, where there's smoke, there's fire. Mark and avoid. Never mind the smoke machine that is actually creating that fog. In other words, people begin to steer us by guilt, by association. If we don't separate from this group of undesirables, everybody else will separate from us. And so the question that you have to ask yourself as a leader is this: do you allow other people to choose your friends, to define the boundaries of your fellowship? Or does Christ define those boundaries? Now, of course, I want to stress here that there are times when we must separate, when we must avoid fellowship with those who profess to be brothers but deny it by high-handed sin. There are times when we must remove leaven from our midst to, as 1 Corinthians 5 says, purge the evil person from among us. What's more, there are times when we might choose to part ways amicably because of differences in ministry philosophy. So if we remember Galatians 2 again, Paul, in the first part of the chapter, was on a mission to the uncircumcised, while the Jerusalem apostles were on a mission to the circumcised. And they said, you go your way, we'll go ours, right hand of fellowship, God bless you. Remember the poor as you do. The mission fields were different, and therefore the ministry philosophies might need to be different, and so they separated. But they still extended that right hand of fellowship. They were still a part of the same people. Even here, though, there's a danger lurking. It's tempting to separate from fellow Christians in order to appease or ingratiate ourselves with our unbelieving target audience. We might call this the danger of winsomeness. Winsomeness, at its best, is seeking to remove unnecessary obstacles to the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9, right? Paul says, I made myself a servant of all in order to win more of them. I became like a Jew to win the Jews, one outside the law to win those outside the law, though I didn't step outside the law of Christ. I became weak in order to win the weak. I became all things to all people in order that I might save some. This good desire, however, to remove unnecessary obstacles can go radically wrong. Rather than trying to win our audience, we often seek to please them, to pander to them, to coddle them. Rather than simply removing distractions from the gospel, we try to remove the offense of the gospel, paring down the rough edges of the truth so as not to alienate our audience. And we discover, this is important, that one of the best ways to build bridges to unbelievers is to share their sympathies, their sensibilities, and their hostilities. Love what they love, hate what they hate. We find ways to communicate. We're not like those Christians. We share your disgust at them. We forget that our deepest allegiance is to Christ and his people, even the members of his body that we regard as foolish and dumb, and I wish they wouldn't do that. To come at it another way, when winsomeness is elevated as the fundamental value, again, it's good in its place, but as the fundamental value, we become fixated on our reputation. And in doing so, we foster cultural conditions conducive to manipulation. We hand our adversaries a steering wheel called what we're known for, and they hang our public image over our heads like the sword of Damocles. And I underscore the danger of being steered by our reputation because many Christians have misguided expectations on precisely this point. Many Christian leaders are prepared to be rejected by men and even persecuted for their faith in Christ, but they are not prepared to be rejected by men because of rank falsehoods, because of lies, because of guilt by association. If it's about substitutionary atonement, I will be persecuted for that. But if it's because I'm associated with some undesirable Christian, no, I will do anything I can to avoid persecution there. And so they begin to engage in what we might call misdirected boldness. Misdirected boldness, what C.S. Lewis described as running around with fire extinguishers whenever there's a flood. Thus, you might have a winsome pastor who dedicates numerous sermons to, quote, smoking out racists in his congregation. Racists, I'll say, who almost certainly do not exist in that room, while soft feminism flourishes under his leadership. He would never dream of preaching boldly so as to smoke out the feminists. This is because under the progressive gaze, credibility and respectability are established through appropriate empathy for designated groups, appropriate anger toward their oppressors, and appropriate differentiation from the wrong kind of Christian. I thank you, God, that I'm not like those power-hungry culture warriors. Or again, they will know that we are respectable Christians by our denunciations of the wrong kind. And those who resisted the false equivalencies and spoke with appropriate biblical clarity and boldness on all sins were policed as harsh, quarrelsome, and obsessed with political power. So, in all of these cases, biblical virtues withered under the progressive gaze. Clarity degenerated into selective nuance and that misdirected boldness. Compassion degenerated into untethered empathy. Kindness became winsome coddling. And a desire for a good reputation, something that Paul commends, became man-pleasing and man-fearing. Candor and honesty were smothered beneath the progressive gaze. The result is that many Christians self-censored and became reluctant to challenge woke ideologies or question proposals related to race, sex, and abuse, and to speak clearly about progressive sins, We whisper about those instead. Partly out of a desire to avoid alienating their target audience, the progressives, partly out of fear of advocates who are looking over their shoulder, and partly out of pressure from other respectable Christians. Now, of course, I want to stress here that there are other versions of this temptation, other gazes that we could live under, okay? You might think of the female gaze, what some have called the longhouse, the centering of feminine needs and feminine methods for controlling, directing, and modeling behavior. There are conservative, right-wing, reactionary versions of the same emotional dynamics. You could live under the based gaze. Though inevitably, those ones are less potent because they lack the wider societal influence that enhances the progressive gaze. In fact, if we press into the psychological challenge of the gaze, what we discover is that the Bible speaks directly to it. What I'm calling the gaze, the Bible simply calls fear of man and people-pleasing. It is a most subtle snare, twisting good things like friendship, partnership, and following our leaders, just like it did in Antioch. Yes, the particular men whom we fear or the people whom we seek to please may vary, but the temptation to do so is universal. And the Bible places a sharp antithesis between seeking the approval of men and seeking the approval of God. Again, Paul in Galatians chapter 1. Am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. There it is, simple as can be. We must choose, serve Christ or please men. Seek human approval or seek divine approval. To put this another way, the scriptures insist that we remember a most basic fact, one so obvious that we are so prone to forget it. Proverbs 5:21, a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. All of us are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account, Hebrews 4:13. In other words, all of us live and speak and act under the divine gaze. The challenge comes in accepting this fact, welcoming this fact, calibrating our sensibilities, our framing of reality, our loves and our hates by what God says in his word and not by any other human gaze, white, black, progressive, or otherwise. But in American culture in the 21st century, it is the progressive gaze that poses the greatest threat to Christian faithfulness. Why? Because given the pervasiveness of progressive ideology in big government, big business, big tech, big education, big sports, big entertainment, and big media, the primary pressure on Christians is from the left. And as we've seen, the progressive gaze is fueled by passions, by pathos, untethered empathy, and untruthful pity, fear of man and desire for approval and respectability. And this reminds us that passions, when unmoored, blind us. They lead us astray. They result in various degrees of self-deception. And I stress this because in many cases, as we reflect on the last 15 years or so, we need not assume malicious intent on the part of those who are being steered and those who attempt to steer others. In fact, making sense of the last decade demands that we stress the complexity of the motives involved in order to avoid simplistic narratives of good guys and bad guys. There really are bad guys, and there really are good guys. But there's a lot of complexity in between. So again, let's picture our line as we did in Galatians one more time. Picture that group of people standing next to each other, all of them with steering wheels on their backs. The steering wheels, of course, are not identical, and not everyone is able to steer everyone else. So at the far end, the secular progressives deliberately and intentionally steer compromised Christian leaders in a worldly direction through credibility and appeals to empathy. Those compromised Christian leaders then take up that progressive cause, baptized with Christian slogans, and they steer the soft-hearted Christians to their left through empathy, or to their right with empathy and a concern for their witness. Then those leaders and soft-hearted Christians overcome the faithful resistance a little farther to the right through a variety of sticks and carrots. waving the banner of missions and evangelism, and the subtle threat of ostracism from respectable Christian circles. And even otherwise faithful men will sometimes go along with it all because they know that so-and-so is a good guy, and I just don't want to rock the boat. In this way, the progressive gaze comes to dominate, not because every Christian leader is consciously setting out to appease progressives directly, but because corporately we've absorbed the progressive categories, sensibilities, and hostilities by osmosis. The influence is indirect and atmospheric. As one friend put it to me, a man drinking water downstream may have no idea that the river's source is polluted, but that doesn't prevent him from being poisoned by it. Jesus warned us about wolves in sheep's clothing, false prophets who masquerade as sheep in order to tear the church apart. The clear implication is that sometimes wolves look like wolves and sometimes they don't. Similarly, hirelings are often just as hard to recognize. A hireling looks like a shepherd, but prioritizes himself over the sheep. As Jesus says in John 10, he who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep, and flees. The wolf snatches them and scatters them. Why does he flee? He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. More than that, that term hireling can sometimes be misunderstood. It gives the impression that such men are really in it for the money, that they're being bought off with cold, hard cash. But here's the reality. Social approval is often the true currency. And again, frequently, it's not approval from the world directly, but rather it's approval from the right kind of Christian, the respectable kind, the empathetic kind, the winsome, to the left, kind. These Christians are frequently difficult to resist because A, they're nice guys, and B, they can technically affirm the correct doctrines. They can always sign your statement of faith, and that insulates them from criticism. Nevertheless, like the Jews and like Barnabas, they too will be led astray. They'll cave out of fear and hypocrisy. It's important to remember that not everyone in Antioch caved. In the midst of that colossal failure of nerve, Paul stands out for his sober-minded courage and leadership. And so in conclusion, what can we learn from him? Well, first, note, Paul acts with purpose. He doesn't react, he responds. He's not another emotional domino that simply caves to the pressure. Paul apparently has a high tolerance for the pain and discomfort of others. This is an essential characteristic for leaders in the church and in your schools. Leaders often intuitively know what actions will result in exasperated emails, frustrated phone calls, and painful conversations. Your intuitions are often very savvy at this moment. You think, I'm about to say it, and then that little voice in your head goes, but you better not. It's tempting to avoid provoking such reactions. It's distressful. But in order for growth and change to occur, leaders must be willing and able to press into conflict with steady presence and then maintain the stamina necessary to follow through in the face of the resistance and sabotage that will inevitably come. Second, Paul takes a stand, and he does so publicly. Peter's error was public, and therefore Paul's correction was public. In taking this stand, Paul's primary goal is to bring clarity, to get beneath the fear and the hypocrisy and the pressure in order to reveal the fundamental issues for everyone to see. In other words, Paul was willing to talk about the elephant in the room. No obfuscation, no clouding the issue, simply clear and direct speech that cuts to the heart of the matter. Look, Peter, your conduct is not in step with the truth of the gospel. This is not simply about mealtime. This is about whether Jesus has in fact torn down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. This is about whether the gospel message truly is Jesus plus nothing. For leaders, this means that we should look for opportunities to move from submerged conflict to open conflict. Submerged conflict is frequently waged by that subtle emotional and reputational pressure. Instead of seeking to persuade with arguments about what is true and what is good and what is wise, submerged conflict brings pressure to conform based on the feelings of an aggrieved group or the reputation of the community. And of course, in their place, again, emotions and reputation do matter. But this is the key. They cannot substitute for rational, moral, and biblical arguments. And the shift to open conflict involves a candid and frank discussion of the underlying moral, theological, and prudential issues in play. We've got to draw it out so that we know what we're talking about. Third, Paul takes responsibility for himself, and he expects others to do the same. Paul expects Peter to see his hypocrisy and to own it. In confronting Peter publicly, Paul is absolutely risking escalation. You just have to put yourself in that room for a minute. This is Peter. It's Peter. Pentecost, remember Pentecost? Remember the courage before the Sanhedrin, right? Remember all of that? Remember, he was that guy. These are his guys. And they've compromised, and here comes Paul walking in and he says, I'm going to say it. And as soon as he does, Peter, how come you, though a Jew, know that we're justified by faith and not by works? Why are you making them live like Jews by your withdrawal? You're compelling them. You're putting pressure on them to add circumcision, to add Sabbath laws, to add food laws so that they can have meals with you. Why are you doing that? What kind of a pin drop in that room? Right? Paul risks it. The risk is worth it. Here's the deal. The conflict and the confusion is already there. Nothing is gained by papering over it, by muttering peace, peace when there is no peace. The corollary of taking responsibility for your own actions is refusing to take the blame for the reactions of others. Because faithful leaders are willing to bring submerged conflict into the light, they are often accused of being the cause of that conflict. For example, the optical illusion at Antioch would be that Paul caused the conflict with Peter. Why are you always causing conflict, Paul? Everywhere you go, there's a riot. But the truth is that Paul simply revealed the conflict and tensions that were already present. And thus he insists, years later, that Peter is the one who stood condemned. Fourth, this is really important. Paul speaks differently to different groups, modeling both clarity and boldness on the one hand and patience and prudence on the other. So in the book of Galatians, we see him condemn committed heretics like the troublers in Galatia, right? Those who trouble you, I wish they'd castrate themselves. He just unloads, calls them false brethren, urging them to castrate themselves. He has sharp words for wolves. He also has sharp words of rebuke for hypocritical leaders like Peter, but he doesn't speak to Peter the way he speaks to the wolves. Paul knows the importance of leadership, but notice that he, even in the passage we read, differentiates between Peter, who he says stands condemned, and the rest of the Jews in Barnabas, who he says were led astray. This doesn't mean Barnabas is off the hook. He still acted hypocritically. But Paul refuses to flatten out that distinction, to treat them all as, you're all the same. They're not all the same. He doesn't treat the situation simplistically. And then, of course, he is patient with those who are confused and troubled by the whole mess and don't really know what's going on, like the Galatians, the Christians in Galatia. To them, he exhorts them. He appeals to them like a father. You foolish Galatians, who's bewitched you? There's an appeal. It's a fatherly appeal. I wish I could be with you. I'm just so perplexed by what's going on here. Different form of speech than the false brethren. And so also, we must recognize the different groups that have contributed to the turmoil we find ourselves in. Yes, there are obvious wolves, apostles from the world who are trying to spread their false ideology. There are wolves in sheep's clothing, false prophets who have secretly snuck in. There are real victims in view. There's also inflated victims who are flopping. There are sincere advocates moved by sincere compassion. There are also opportunistic cry bullies. There are naive peacemakers, and there are empathetic peacemongers. There are confused sheep. There are refugees from the world. There are respectable hirelings in it for the reputation. And there are decent shepherds with hireling tendencies, hireling moments. There are reactive shepherds who saw the issue, saw what was going on, but resisted foolishly, unwisely, without prudence or wisdom. And thank God there are sober-minded shepherds who are faithful at their post. Paul acts with prudence and wisdom all throughout this situation. He resisted the pressure to circumcise Titus, but he was willing in a different context to circumcise Timothy for the sake of the ministry. He's clear on first-order issues. This is not in keeping with the truth of the gospel. He saw how small compromises could threaten the foundation. But he also triages secondary issues. He could be patient and long-suffering with various errors. And that patience and prudence, that courage and boldness flowed from his maturity and his sober-mindedness, from his heartfelt desire to please God. He is no pleaser of men, but a servant of Christ. He was crucified with Christ. He no longer lives. Christ lives on his behalf, and keeping the approval of God ever before his face enabled him to resist the attempts to steer and manipulate him by false accusations and guilt by association. And just as a note of hope, as we wrap it up here, though Paul doesn't record Peter's response to the confrontation here in Antioch, the book of Acts in chapter 15 testifies to Peter's full acceptance of the Gentiles. And at that moment, his staunch resistance to the false brethren who would require them to be circumcised. In other words, Peter came around. By the grace of God, it seems that not only cowardice, but courage is contagious. Thank you.